Jesus and the figure of Jesus as a sign of persecution, which was the case in previous centuries. What remains a major difficulty, however, is the image of Jesus on the cross. Okay? An image of death, and therefore an image of impurity in Jewish consciousness, because remember one thing, death in Judaism is the father of all sources of impurity. So clearly, from a Jewish legal perspective, a figure of death that you see in churches, on the street, so on and so forth, clearly created a problem, clearly was difficult. And Judaism had a great difficulty to deal with that. How can a religion of life, as Judaism likes to see itself, relate to a figure that is the ultimate symbol of suffering and dying? And here, there was a real difficulty in the relationship. Now, when I wrote that after the Shoah, Judaism is closer to Christianity than ever before, it's because of the following reason. The reality of the Shoah in Jewish religious thought is slowly emerging to both rabbis and lay people. With it, the realization that the centrality of suffering and death is suddenly now also part of mainstream Judaism. Which, remember, when we see death as the major source of impurity, what it means is when I live my Jewish life, of course I do have to face death when it happens, but as soon as it's there, it goes to the side because it's impure. Suddenly, I have the Shoah in front of me. And I cannot just take the Shoah and say, I put it to the side because it's all impurity. So suddenly, Judaism comes to terms with the fact that in religious terms, in theological terms, we too are going to have to face, and even though it's not an image, but we're going to have to face the reality of death and suffering in the forefront of our religious thinking. And that in itself makes maybe what Jesus is for Christianity a little bit more understandable to Judaism. Now, I'm not saying that the two events are comparable. I'm not comparing the death of Jesus and the Shoah. I mean, doing that is offensive for everybody. I mean, that is really missing the point. I'm just trying to say we have a reality that suddenly makes us realize that we too have to deal with that issue, which is one of the key symbols of Christianity. And somehow that makes us maybe a little more capable of perceiving what Jesus is for Christians than we were able to do before. Now at the same time, and that's the paradox, at the same time, I know that in Christian thinking, of course, you cannot simply leave it at the death of Jesus. The death of Jesus is followed by a resurrection, so life comes back. Okay? But in a very paradoxical way, I mean, this is where Judaism and Christianity today are maybe most apart. We have great difficulty with salvation. If we can understand maybe a little bit more the symbol of death and suffering, we have great difficulty with salvation for a very simple reason. If the death of 6 million wasn't enough to bring salvation, I wonder what can bring salvation. And so therefore, there is a big question mark that suddenly Judaism puts on salvation, okay? Which in previous century didn't really exist. You know, there was a hope. There was a very strong hope. There was a very strong belief. At times with questions, but most of the time an unquestioned belief about the possibility of a general messianic coming of age, resurrection, salvation, however you want to name it. Suddenly, because of the Shoah, that really creates a huge distance from a Jewish point of view with regard to salvation. So somehow we have those conflicting views. And all that comes, if you want, to the forefront when you reread the text of Nostra Aetate, and you see that in it, what the Catholic Church affirms is the concept that's been called the never revoked, reaffirming for the first time in the history of the church that the covenant between God and the Jewish people is never revoked. Whatever the mystery of the covenant with Christianity and a renewed covenant and all of that, whatever that reality, there is an affirmation that the covenant with the Jewish people is maintained. That's a revolution in the thinking of the church, but it happens at the time when the Jews are questioning their own covenant, which we didn't do before. We're questioning our own covenant enough to read a lot of the American rabbinic writer on post-Shoah theology to realize what it means to re-question the validity of the covenant. Many of them, they don't put it to the side, they don't disregard it, but they're clearly putting it into question. Because again, if you look at it simply, how a God that should be covenanted with the Jewish people should have allowed that to happen. So clearly, this is a time where we question our own covenant, and that is the time when the church suddenly doesn't question our own covenant. And so it feels that sometime in the Jewish-Christian dialogue, we are just passing like this. And the difficulty is actually to meet there, and to meet on a plane where we can understand each other. And I have to tell you that in the discussions that I have in the classes that I give, those are definitely the key issue that we're discussing. I have two classes on Jewish theology, one on post-Shoah Jewish theology, another one on covenant theology. I know a lot of people don't like the word theology applied to Judaism because it's certainly not structured as Christian theology is, but nevertheless, religious thinking if you want. Those are definitely the issue that we discuss. And that is really, I think, the center of the experience of the encounter at the theological level, at the religious level. There is here a very strong element of discussion with a lot of uncertainties, and it's a difficult, certainly a difficult topic. So this theological background I wanted to mention because I think it's an important one. I want to move on because I see the clock is ticking, and we want to have time for questions. So I want to move on to the next part of that presentation, the last part of the presentation, which is maybe a little bit more personal, if you want, about what it means for me to teach at the Gregorian, and what do I get from being there, and what do they get from me, I hope, as well. And some of it, I have 7, 8 or something elements that I want to mention. Some of them might sound to you not that important, but somehow for me they are. The first thing that for me was quite striking was something that I would call facing the numbers somehow. I just give you an idea. I mean, when I was at the Rabbinic seminary, the number of graduates per year were 2. Okay, that's a good year. Okay, because we're a very small group. There's not that many Jews. We're very few. In Europe, at least, we're extremely few. I mean, if you think of it, I mean, in Brussels, there's like 5,000 Jews. Okay. So, in the whole of Belgium, even with the Antwerp community, which is a little bit the equivalent to the Brooklyn community, it still doesn't go above 30,000. Okay, so just Brussels, 1 million inhabitants, 5,000 Jews. Okay, so we very few anyhow. So we were 2 when I graduated from the Rabbinic seminary, and clearly one of the things that struck me when I arrived, I mean, I knew I couldn't expect something as small as the Rabbinic seminary when I arrived at the Greg, but nevertheless the number is impressive. From Jewish eyes, somehow, what might look obvious to you, from Jewish eyes, the number is impressive. And what's impressive in it is that it actually shatters some of the conviction that you have and that you don't always want to admit. And the conviction somehow is this. Because we've always been small in numbers in Judaism, we've always had a tendency to compensate our small number by a sort of a belief in erudition and level of knowledge. So, you know, we few, but we're very good. we do the thing really, it's a bit elitist like this. There is an element of elitism, I don't know what you say in English. And therefore you say, okay, well, you know, if there's 3,000 students, I mean, are they really that good? I mean, you know, can you really have 3,000 good students? You know, 2, yes, but 3,000, no. And somehow when you start to know the students by teaching them, then you actually realize that numbers have nothing to do with level, of course. That is all a question of individuals. And that shatters some of the preconception, which is, you know, one is more level and the other one is more number, and then you suddenly realize it's actually more complex than that. So a very simple observation of just crossing the gate and the entrance in this place gives you that first feeling, which then makes you think and reassess your Jewish assumptions about number. And I thought that was, for me, an important and an interesting entry point, if you want, into my experience there. The other thing that I've noticed, and I sometimes find myself as the comforter of the head of the Bea Center at the Gregorian, because even after 50 years, when you spend enough time within the walls of the Greg, you realize the hesitation that are still very much part of that process in the church. And what I mean by that is I'm well aware that the relationship with Judaism, the fact of having the Center of Jewish Studies in the center of the Gregorian, is not positively seen by everybody. Okay? So even after 50 years, there's a lot of hesitation. There's a lot of people who are not happy. And I know that. And I know it sometimes from my personal experience of some words that are said to me, which are sometimes unpleasant, not too often. But also because I hear what is said. And sometimes I'm the one who has to comfort the people in charge of the Bea Center to tell them, say, you know, don't despair if you see that some people are not interested in Judaism or don't want Judaism or don't want this or don't want that, because essentially there's a very simple truth. You cannot sort out 2,000 years of antagonism in 50 years. There's no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts in history. I mean, this is one, for me, it's one of the great lessons I learned from the story of the Exodus. It's, you know, there's plenty of stories to learn, but the story of the Exodus, 40 years for 300 kilometers. And what it means is there's no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts. And this is what I see, you know. And I tell this, the head of the Bea Center, I tell him, I say, you know, you have to hang on. It's normal that not everybody wants. And I tell you, not everybody wants what I do in the Jewish community. Okay? There's lots of people in the Jewish community who consider that I shouldn't be there at all. Part of it is jealousy, for sure, but part of it is also because people don't want. People don't want to say, you know, how can you go there given the history of what happened? You know, I mean, I hear it, you know, so I know. But you know, the one time I was exposed to that in a very direct way was on the first year when I was there. Something very silly, but I didn't quite understand because the information is always given in Italian, and given the fact that I don't speak it, it doesn't help to understand how the system runs. But there was always a problem where apparently I was like 1 minute. I keep the student for 1 minute too long. Okay, which given the historical reality of the relationship between the church and Judaism, didn't appear to me to be a major issue. But there was a teacher, Jesuit teacher, who was using the classroom right after me, and each time he said to me, "This is not how we do it here." The very nice thing about this, a little bit unpleasant experience, is that the students went to complain against him at the end. So somehow, but you are facing from time to time the reality of those petty debates, refusal of being a little bit more open towards each other, and okay, it's 50 years is a short period of time. That's what I meant. Another point that for me was very important was it gave me an opportunity to discover Christianity. And again, there is this vision in Judaism that is shared not by the educated people within the Jewish community, but by people who are not particularly educated, which is to say, okay, well, Christianity is a simplification of Judaism, and this is how it was historically. It was a question of converting the pagans at the time, and so therefore it made it more simple, and so on and so forth. And that rolls on over the centuries of saying, okay, we are a complicated tradition, and Christianity is a simplified tradition. And somehow you meet people who can show you through the discussion you have with them in class that there's nothing simple. That it's a very subtle tradition. That they have a level of erudition and knowledge that is exactly equal to yours. That when you assume something on Christianity, and sometimes I do have to assume something on Christianity because I read the text and I say, well, clearly that Jewish writer, this is what he says about Christianity, and everybody raise their hand and say, but that's only that trend of Christianity, but there's another, that's only that particular historical event, and so on. And for us as Jews, we look at Christianity as a monolithic, particularly the Catholic Church, as a monolithic reality because of the Pope. And then suddenly I'm in front of people who are part of that, and who come to tell me, or say, no, but hold on, you can't make that generalization because this, because that, and then suddenly you realize that, when people come and tell me Judaism says that, I say, well, Judaism says that, Judaism also says something else, and it depends who you ask, and it depends which rabbi you read, which commentary you read, and suddenly you realize that you're discovering something that you didn't have the opportunity to discover before, and that very few in the Jewish community do discover, because, as I said at the beginning, mostly Judaism can be lived within its own system. Historically, it doesn't technically need Christianity to be understood. So that really, for me, was an important point. I mentioned earlier, I think the question of the exam was a very difficult one for me, and it's the issue of giving the marks, okay, which again is a silly thing, but when you have the impression to be part of something that's very much bigger than you, and that you are only very lucky to be there, and suddenly you have to bring it down to an exam question and an exam marking, it feels out of sync somehow. And I'm always dreading the time of the exam, because on one hand, I'm a professor there, so I'm professional in the sense that I'm not doing whatever I think it's nice. Or not nice, because I could take the other way around and say, 2,000 years of anti-Semitism will be paid. So, you don't want to do it either way, of course. But there's a disconnect, if you want, between suddenly a reality of an academic center and that. And that for me is not, I'm not quite satisfied with the way I've dealt with that. Another point I would like to make is that it also made me aware of being in touch with all of these priests and students, is that we do have some very different cultural vision of sometimes what's important and what's not. Where is the center of things? And I'll give you an example. I teach a Talmud class at the Greg, and the students had the greatest of difficulty to understand that when you do Talmud, the conclusion is not that interesting. It's the